And a rigid mindset is like actually also inherent to if it fits your macros in the original form, because it's like you eat, say, 2,500 calories a day, while you're bulking as a woman, for example, you have to eat exactly those 2,500. And that's not productive either, because it doesn't really matter. All by your bulking, it might matter, but when you're cutting, when you're trying to lose fat, it really doesn't matter so much if one day you're 100 lower, the other day you're 100 over, as long as the average equals out over time and you're within the ballpark, most days, then it's more about the long-term perspective, which is your overall lifestyle. So that's a flexible mindset.
Today's guest is Menno Henselmans. Menno is an international public speaker, scientist, and online physique coach. He has several pro card winning clients and international prize winners in physique sports and powerlifting. Menno is also the author of the book, The Science of Self-Control, where he discusses the essentials of how the human mind works, what willpower is, how to be more productive, how to stick to your diet, how to make your workouts less effortful, and how to keep yourself motivated. So in today's episode, we're diving into the dieting section of Menno's book and discussing topics related to the importance of having flexible diet control versus rigid diet control, the truth about artificial sweeteners, the importance of psychological flexibility, how to manage food cravings and appetite, low-fat diets versus low-carb keto diets, and the differences in what Menno prefers for himself and his clients, and lots more. This episode is jam-packed with lots of practical information and tips that I think you're really going to benefit from. So let's get into it. Welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I'm here with Menno Henselmans. How are you today?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you. We were talking off air how it's been, we're in completely different time zones, and this is our third try for trying to get this recording going. You're in Brazil right now, which is awesome. So I'm excited to finally connect and talk about a few different subjects within your new book, which really excited to dive into that. But before we do you want to give our viewers or listeners just a kind of quick background, introduce yourself, how you got into like the fitness and nutrition world?
Sure. My name's Menno Henselmans. I'm originally Dutch, but I'm now a digital nomad. So currently I live in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But that's only for probably 3 to 6 months. And then I'll be going to Europe for a bit. I started off working originally as a business consultant in the Netherlands, but that was the career path that was more set by my parents and by my environment, the prestigious kind of thing to do, not really what my passion was, which had always been sports and especially strength training. So I started writing about that, and then people started asking me for coaching. I became an online coach, and that went pretty well. People started asking me, how do you coach people? Like, how do you get these kind of results? And that led to my online PT courses, and that expanded quite rapidly, which I now certify people in Spanish, French, German, Dutch, and English. And over the course of a few years, I mainly started writing about fitness, but occasionally I threw in some more lifestyle, psychology things, because my education actually originally was in behavioral economics, which is a lot of behavioral psychology and statistics. And that led me to write this book, my latest book, my only book. And it's more about just general self-improvement, the science of self-control. It's a lot of things that I could not put in Facebook or Instagram posts and required more in-depth knowledge beforehand. And a lot of things that I think are relevant for everybody. That's why because a lot of people ask me, your book is kind of tangent on what you're normally writing. But I think these are things that are relevant for everyone. If you care about self-improvement or happiness, which I think everyone should, then the book's relevant. So I think you can always do that publication-wise. But if you're known for writing about happiness, you suddenly write an exercise science book, I think that will be harder.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I read through it. I think there's so many different topics within it. We were kind of talking off air how you have a few different sections related to diet, productivity, exercise, motivation. There's kind of all those different sections, and then tons of like subcategories and then subcategories. And even some of the things that, like, for myself, as I was reading through it, I've been a coach for a long time. as well, coaching women in the fitness nutrition space.
Mhm.
And some of the things that we think are kind of, common sense. And at least for me being a coach and a lot of things that I talk to my clients about, it was just like, you kind of broke it down in a way that made a lot of sense, and even more tips to kind of help with specifically the dieting side of things, which I think,
Mhm.
a lot of people are interested in, especially my listeners, kind of talking all about nutrition. This podcast, we talk all about nutrition, exercise, all that jazz, mindset, motivation. And so today I really want to dive into kind of the dieting section of your book. And I have a list here of a few of the subsections that I think would
Mhm.
be awesome to get into, and just have the viewers or listeners get a little bit more in depth on, practical takeaways. Because I think that's the biggest thing. Like, people want practical things that they can take away
Mhm.
from, these podcast episodes and implement in their life, right away. So I do have a list of a few things. So I might look over at my screen here just to prompt me. But the first thing is talking about how empty rewards can help us stick to our diets. And more specifically, we can kind of go through that. And then more specifically within that, I know you talked a little bit about artificial sweeteners and natural sweeteners, and that's a question that I get a lot. So I'd love to hear
Mhm.
your opinion, your take on that, based off of what you know about the research. So yeah, let's dive into that one first.
Sure. Yeah. The thing about the title is, it sounds paradoxical, and it is, because a lot of people have this idea that the reason they need, or they feel they need food, is because of the energy it provides. But the energy that's in food is very different. It's actual physical energy. It's very different from mental energy. Mental energy is, as it's colloquially used, is it's an informal term for more motivation, self-control. When we say we are energized, we generally feel like we're motivated to do things. So often it's more about motivation, which is not really related to the actual provision of physical energy. Like, you don't need physical energy to, if you're motivated to go to the gym, it's not the actual, you're not actually limited by the substrate to walk over or bicycle over to the gym, right? It's a motivational, it's a psychological limitation. So these many times when we feel like we're struggling with the diet, it's not really energy that we need. In fact, there are a lot of studies on, for example, carbohydrate rinsing, which show that just rinsing carbohydrates in your mouth and not actually swallowing them have the same effect and the same improvement in performance in the gym as well as actually consuming the carbohydrates. And that shows it's not a metabolic effect, it's a psychological effect. And there's even a meta-analysis, which is, I think, incredibly cool, that shows that the side effects, like the mental side effects that people report when they're dieting, of a diet, are actually uncorrelated, completely uncorrelated with the degree of weight loss. Such that people that try to lose weight but fail, meaning they're actually in energy balance, they're not in energy deficit, have the same amount of problems, mental problems with the diet, as people that are actually losing weight and are just in energy deficit. So this chapter goes into ways that you can make yourself feel better without, or get that sort of sensation of, when you need food, get something in. And also, like, things in the book are like very low calorie cappuccino, low calorie kind of ice creams, and it can even be something that is not food at all, like just watching TV, and that's a bit of a different chapter, but you can watch a series or something. Anything that just gives you pleasure, basically, can take the role of the self-medication on foods that you would otherwise be prone to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, because that's something that, I encourage in, when I'm working with clients as well, and even with myself when I'm going through a dieting phase, kind of finding those alternative options. I call them, sometimes I call them hunger hacks. I have like a hunger hack, like ebook on, that's the first thing when you go to my website, it's like, download the hunger hacks ebook, because it's the resource that I found most helpful for clients or anybody who's interested in, or going on in a fat loss phase or anything like that. And I think that has been a game changer for myself and for a lot of clients. But one question that I always get is about artificial sweeteners, right? Like, are they bad for you? Do they actually cause you to want to eat more? Do they, wreak havoc on your gut? All of these things that are kind of, there's some interesting research that might not be the best research out there, from what I've seen at least, on artificial sweeteners. So I'm curious kind of what you found from the research realm, and then also, from a practical standpoint with your clients.
Artificial sweeteners are one of these things that, a bit like the effect of lockdowns during the corona crisis, where science is actually quite uniform in saying what the actual effect is, and the media are saying the complete opposite thing constantly. And therefore, most people have a very strong opinion that there is actually a lot of research showing that artificial sweeteners are harmful, to the extent even that many people prefer sugar over artificial sweeteners. And if you actually look at regulatory bodies and because every substance that goes into the market, in any market, there goes a lot of testing, not only by the manufacturers of the product, but also by regulatory agencies. And there's also a lot of independent scientific research on sweeteners. And time again, all the big reviews, all the regulatory bodies have approved artificial sweeteners as safe for human consumption up to anything remotely reasonable in terms of quantities. So yes, there are studies showing that artificial sweeteners in rodents can have harmful effects. If you translate those dosages to human equivalents, you're talking about someone drinking probably 10 liters of Coca-Cola per day. I think at that point, you probably have other issues than the artificial sweeteners. So yeah. It's really not a concern. In fact, in this particular case, it's double misguided to look at those studies, and those are of course what the media always portray, and then they don't mention it's in rodents, and they don't say it's what the human equivalent dosage is. But it's particularly misguided because the reason they test for the safety of these products is by just giving more and more of a substance, and anything is toxic as if you just give enough. If you give a human enough water, they will die. So anything is toxic in enough with sufficient quantities. And they actually test for the safety of these things by just giving more and more and more, and seeing at which point the mice or rats or whatever get side effects. For example, when they get cancers. So it's actually by design that we have research showing there are side effects of these substances. That's how we know at which doses we can still safely consume them. So I think actually, based on other research on diet adherence, which generally shows that artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners in general, because stevia is in exactly the same boat, is not only safe, but also beneficial for diet adherence. So I think it makes perfect sense, because you basically give people sugar without calories. That's literally what it essentially is, especially sucralose, because it's also heat resistant, etc. So whenever someone wants sugar, you can just replace it with sucralose, and you save a lot of calories, and you have essentially the same product. So it's a very, very easy way to save a lot of calories. And I think they're absolutely great. And especially if you really want to consume them, and you find yourself feeling like I shouldn't do it because there may be harm, that is probably exactly when you need it. Because if someone says, well, I don't consume any of it, I don't care about sugar, I don't care about sweeteners, okay, fine. But if you do feel the need to consume sugary products, then definitely at least start with replacing them with sweeteners.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, like, obviously everybody is their own individual, and some people will respond differently to specific types of artificial sweeteners. I know, I've had some clients get headaches when they consume one particular artificial sweetener versus another. And, everybody's so individual. But then I have, other clients and, myself who don't have any reaction or haven't had any reaction for years. So it does obviously come down to also that individual person. But in general, I think there's just so much misinformation and fear mongering out there, like you mentioned in the media, that is just so just not true. And like you said, anything in excessive amounts is toxic, like even water, like you just mentioned. So I think it just, is kind of weighing your options there, and also realizing one thing that people say, and I heard this a lot, is like, they're like, I'm going to have a regular Coke, not a Diet Coke, because I don't want the chemicals in the Diet Coke. And I'm like, wait, so you don't think there's chemicals in the regular Coke plus a ton of sugar? I think it's just reframing the mindset around that, and just being educated, really. And as you mentioned, the research shows that, that
decision making is exactly as you say. It's like we have this compound that might potentially be harmful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to consume something that at least there is a strong consensus about it really is harmful, right?
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly, with aspartame in particular, because aspartame is something that a lot of people, they think they get headaches and everything from it, or they actually do. There's research, when you ask these people in blinded research, you give them aspartame or placebos, they often cannot tell. So very often these effects are actually nocebo. And of course, I'm not saying there is nobody that nobody gets headaches, actual headaches, physiologically speaking, from aspartame. Surely there is some person, some special snowflake with a metabolism that for some reason gets headaches from it. But for most people, actually, even these effects are nocebo. So, and nocebo effects can be very real, and especially with something so demonized and stigmatized as artificial sweeteners. It's all the more common.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of overall, based off of the legitimate research we have, artificial sweeteners are not dangerous unless you consume them in astronomical amounts, which is not realistic. But if anybody is still worried about that, or they do notice for themselves, individual issues, it's always about doing more research yourself and making sure that you're getting that from a place that is actual legitimate research and not just media crap.
Right. In the book, I don't go into this, but on my website, actually a very detailed article on aspartame safety and an article specifically about the supposed gut issues and gut microbiome effects of artificial sweeteners. So that's something to check out. I don't have like in-depth research, only on my Facebook and Instagram page about sucralose and the like, but the story is very similar.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we'll link those we'll link that article or the two articles in the show notes so anybody listening can check those out. Awesome. Okay, so the next topic I wanted to get into, and this is something that I'm a huge fan of over the years, utilizing with my clients, is it's kind of the topic of how not taking breaks can actually break your diet. I love that's how you titled that section, which I think is very clever. So just kind of talking about the implementation of diet breaks and refeeds and how you've seen that to be useful, with your clients. I know I have a lot of, like I mentioned, have a lot of success with those with not only my clients, but myself as well. Can we just talk about, why that's the case? Why, actually taking a pause in the diet, even though it might slow things down just a little bit, can actually get you to your end goal maybe faster in the long run?
It's not necessarily about diet breaks and refeeds. It's more generally about taking breaks from working, or not even just the diet, but also from working and any kind of thing that drains you. So basically what's happening is self-control failure. What happens is when you're doing something that is not inherently enjoyable for a certain period of time, it actually makes you unhappier. That's how especially the anterior cingulate cortex, it's basically like a meter that it allocates your attention. And if it keeps your attention on something that's not rewarding, it's like it's struggling and it's making you unhappier. So to keep your attention focused on something you don't like doing, you actually need to be happier in other ways. So you can do that with these empty rewards, with diet sodas, but also by just taking breaks. And that can be a break from worrying about food, but it can also be a break from work. Just making sure that you don't get super deprived or drained from the kind of work you're doing, because at work also a lot of people find themselves needing to snack, or after a long day at work, they come home and then they're super drained and then they feel they need to eat. So if you just make sure, basically the general message is that you should just be avoiding being very drained and just having enough, especially essentially happiness generating moments in your life to make everything balanced. That's essentially the point. So if a lot of people think that productivity and diet adherence, they have a very disciplinary approach to it, where it's just like more and more and more. If it doesn't, you work harder. If you fail, you try again, you keep trying. With your diet, you just need to stick with it. Productivity, you just need to sleep less, work harder. And that doesn't work for the vast majority of people. If you have insane motivation, then you can be one of those individuals that just pushes for everything and just does everything. But for most of us, mere mortals, you cannot just keep pushing all the time, because you'll just get extremely unhappy. And you need to have a certain level of well-being in life. And I mean, not just because otherwise why the hell are you doing it, but also because actually mentally it becomes so much so much more difficult. Like if you're sleep deprived, if you're stressed, if you're psychologically drained, it's so much more difficult to stick to your diet than if you take breaks, make sure that you have moments in life that just make you happy. Everything's so much easier.
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of gets me into the next topic about like the psychological flexibility that you talk about in the book. More specifically, I think you phrased it rigid diet control versus flexible diet control. Can we dive into that a little bit? Because I think that, this topic, they go together, and I really want to talk about that as well.
Definitely. I think it's one of the most important things in terms of dieting mindset, not having a rigid mindset. And it's a little paradoxical because you want to be motivated. You want to have control in your diet, because some people go the complete opposite direction. Where, nothing matters. You don't have control. You just eat whatever you want all the time. That obviously doesn't work either. You need control, but it needs to be flexible. So you need to be oriented on the goals, the things that really matter, like long-term energy intake, like your average weekly energy intake. That's something that really matters. So you need to find sustainable ways to reduce your average weekly energy intake over time if you want to lose more fat. And if you think of your calories, like if it fits your macros, for example, is good in terms of flexibility, that it says, well, you have a certain calorie allotment, and you can, in the book I discuss thinking this as a budget. Like you have a certain amount of calories that you can spend. You don't have to spend all of them, but you can. You can spend them on whatever you like, essentially. Now, certain foods are obviously going to make it a lot easier for you to get into a calorie deficit than others. Because if you fill your calories with 2,000 calories of ice cream, then your budget's pretty much gone, and then you haven't eaten much. So not only are you going to be deficient in nutrients, but you're going to be hungry, etc. But in principle, yeah, you could lose fat. And there are a few professors. I think one professor did the Twinkie diet. So he literally ate Twinkies and just supplements. And he showed people that you can actually lose a lot of fat by just eating essentially junk food and supplements. He probably didn't feel great, though, during these periods. So it's much better if you actually eat a healthy diet while doing it. And that's what flexible control is. And a rigid mindset is like actually also inherent to if it fits your macros in the original form, because it's like you eat, say, 2,500 calories a day while you're bulking as a woman, for example. You have to eat exactly those 2,500. And that's not productive either, because it doesn't really matter. Well, by your bulking, it might matter, but when you're cutting, when you're trying to lose fat, it really doesn't matter so much if one day you're 100 lower, the other day you're 100 over. As long as the average equals out over time and you're within the ballpark, most days, then it's more about the long-term perspective, which is your overall lifestyle. So that's a flexible mindset to approach it, and also to think of failure as a learning experience rather than thinking it as, I failed as a person. No, what happened is you tried one thing that didn't work. So now that's giving you knowledge that you should do it another way. And that makes you better at dieting, because dieting is a skill that you need to learn. Everyone needs a lot of experience doing it, especially when it comes to traveling, social eating events, peer pressure. Just having a good diet at home is one thing, but it takes a lot of skill to master it as a whole lifestyle.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think what you mentioned about, the flexibility side of things, and especially, when you're dieting in a fat loss phase, I definitely utilize calorie cycling, and there's so many different ways to utilize that, on a weekly basis for different clients, but it all comes back to like what their lifestyle is, right? And what they can adhere to best. And sometimes it takes, that testing and assessing to really see what works, and maybe we fail, but then it's like, okay, we learned that didn't work, so try something else. And so I think that's super important to realize. I think you hit on that very well. But another question I had, and I just lost my train of thought. What was my question? Oh, man.
I'm actually also a fan of calorie cycling. I like that. And also having, for example, like protein sparing modified fast days are one thing that I sometimes like in clients. Like going relatively low, or really low, the calories one day, and that saves up a lot of calories for the other days. Because generally you find that research on calorie cycling finds people are at least equally adherent to the diet, and in at least 2 studies more adherent. And that's probably because it's easier to give relatively high amount of effort for short periods compared to the constant drag and drain of giving a certain amount of effort every single day.
Yeah, I agree. I use PSMF days all the time with clients, and I have a lot of clients in the or coming from the lower carb ketogenic space who have been, they've implemented different fasting protocols and things like that. And, the name of this podcast is MetFlex and Chill. It's all about metabolic flexibility and kind of getting away from the super rigid, keto approach, which, I did for years, and I worked with a lot of clients for years, to realizing that, you can still get the benefits of, implementing keto days or, lower carb days, but you don't have to stay there forever. And so implementing different fasting protocols has been really beneficial for myself and a lot of clients, especially PSMF days. I've actually recorded podcasts just about PSMF days. So I'm a huge fan of those, especially if you, particularly if you understand how to utilize them, in a way that is practical for you, and you're not like, I'm going to go on a PSMF diet for months on end. That might not be the best idea, but implementing specific days can be super beneficial, because exactly what you said, sometimes it's easier for people to adhere for a shorter period of time versus just a long, dragged out period of time where you're just, on a linear intake. So yeah, definitely beneficial. So I still can't remember my question, but maybe it'll come back to me. I'll move on to the next topic that I want to talk about. So kind of all around, and obviously these all go together within kind of the dieting realm of things, but around just like food cravings and kind of talking about how to kind of train your mind to be more mindful about the things that are happening. And I think I had a note here, you were talking about the forbidden fruit effect. So maybe we can dive into that a little bit. I know it kind of goes with the flexibility rigid side of things as well.
Yeah, the forbidden fruit effect is something that a lot of people think is a really big problem, but it's actually not as much of a problem, or as often a problem as people think. But it is specifically a problem in the type of setting that's where we have one really good study on. What they did is they gave people any type of diet. And the only difference between the two groups was that one group was given a diet and they were told, you can't eat bread. No matter what you do, you cannot eat bread. And the other group was just told, here's your diet, go diet. And what happened is the group that couldn't eat bread did significantly worse in terms of diet adherence. And that's the forbidden fruit effect. Because especially if for no reason you tell people you can't have this, then it becomes very attractive. It's like, every time you're thinking, also if you think of sort of the diet rules or what kind of diet you're on, every time you tell someone on the no bread diet, it's like constantly you're thinking about bread. And that's how you create cravings. Like something that you're not supposed to have, but does have some appeal, and you're constantly rewarded, you're constantly reminded of it. Now, the best way generally to get rid of cravings is, in my book, I say the best way to get rid of a craving is to kill it, or to starve it specifically. Because most research find that even very restrictive diets, which are not very good for adherence overall, are actually very effective to get rid of cravings. Because cravings occur when you're feeding that craving. Like there is nothing, that's one of the most important things I think to realize about food cravings, is that there is nothing in your body that makes you want to eat a certain food. There's this common belief where it's like, I need the zinc in this food or something. No, there's lots of research on this, especially on pregnancy and food disorders that result in cravings for really weird stuff like pica, for dirt and ice and everything. And there's no correlation between what people crave and what they actually need. And during pregnancy, you often see complete opposites even. Like meat aversion is one of the most common aversions during pregnancy. And meat is something that you actually benefit much more from than otherwise when you're pregnant, because it's high in zinc, iron, energy generally, depending on what type of meat you eat, and protein. And these are exactly all things that you need much more of when you're pregnant. So your bodily requirements and things you crave are not correlated. It's very wishful thinking often, just trying to tell yourself, you want this pizza because it has some nutrients. No, you can get those nutrients much more effectively from vegetables or whatever. So it really isn't the food that you need at all. It's just the pleasure. And if you think of what people crave, it's almost always very tasty, non-satiating food, almost always high carb and high fat, often both, and generally low protein. Often processed food as well. So it's just, everyone likes these foods. You don't hear anyone saying like, God, I'm just dying for some asparagus right now. Like,
Yeah.
we don't crave these things. They're just not as tasty. Like, let's be real. If some people like asparagus, that's awesome. Like, I have one client, he loved Brussels sprouts. And I told him, okay, that's your golden ticket right there. You're just gonna satisfy that craving every single day. You're gonna just eat lots and lots of Brussels sprouts. And that was basically, when I told him that's it. That was the diet. That's all he needed. Because he could just eat that whenever he was hungry. He'd eat Brussels sprouts. You need more nutrients, any type. Brussels sprouts is pretty much all of them. So that was it. That's all he needed. And he didn't have much trouble dieting after that. So yeah, that's really what it comes down to with cravings. It's just hunger given a form for something that generally everyone else likes to do. And if you're reminded of it or you try to eat it, in fact, research finds that the frequency with which you indulge in a craving is how much stronger the craving gets. And the amount you eat doesn't even matter, because it's being reminded. It has nothing to do with your metabolism or anything. It's just being reminded of that food. And especially then, if it's also a forbidden fruit effect where you tell yourself you cannot eat it, then it becomes worse. Instead, you should tell yourself, okay, these are high calorie foods that are probably not worth it, or you should reflect on whether you think they're worth it. You can eat them if you want, but it's gonna make your dieting a lot harder. So you can choose. Right now, you can have the chocolate cake, and it's not gonna be as good for your health, and you're probably gonna overeat, and you may still be hungry after that, but you do have the chocolate cake. Or you can have the high protein cheesecake or high protein chocolate version. Generally with chocolate, with cacao, you can actually make low calorie versions pretty well. And then you do stick to your diet. You do get all your nutrients in, you won't be hungry, and you'll lose some fat. So it's about making those decisions and becoming mindful of them and acceptant, basically.
Yeah, it's about, like you said, realizing there's a trade-off between, what you're choosing, and sometimes it's a better option, depending on where you're at. And sometimes the, indulgent option is a better option for your specific, scenario, but it all comes back to taking a second to just think through that first versus just, seeing the chocolate cake and like, oh, chocolate cake, and then just like eating it right away and then feeling guilty about it afterwards. Like, all right, maybe take like 1 minute, step away, and like really think about, what the trade-off you're making to have that chocolate cake. So all the things that you just mentioned. So yeah, the mindfulness side of thing, I think the psychological side of dieting is like that's just all of, for me, at least from what I've seen, it's like, there's so much, obviously there's a physical side, right? You're going into a calorie deficit, there's physical things that happen, physiological things that happen, but this psychological side is what people tend to struggle the most with. I do have a question. So when, people say that processed foods and foods that are, high in a combination of fat and carbs, they're manufactured to make us want to eat more and manufactured to like change our brain chemistry. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, it's true in the sense that, but in a simple sense that they manufacture food that people like. So they manufacture food that as tasty as possible, and food that is very tasty activates our reward pathways in our brain. So it will show up on like a brain scan and fMRI or something as activating your reward pathways a lot. And that's intentional. So, but it sounds so very sinister if you formulate a certain way. But like I said, if you just simplify it down and just very bluntly say, yeah, they just manufacture tasty food, right? Everyone wants tasty food. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Like, food is not addictive. There's a lot of research on that. You can actually become addicted to eating, but most people are not. But there's no such thing as a certain food that's particularly addictive. They've actually done research on that with chocolate, which you can do, for example, by having cacao extracts in food that doesn't taste like chocolate, and white versus dark chocolate, etc. You can make these kind of comparisons and do that with people that think they're addicted to chocolate, and there's no effect. So when they're blinded, there's no more effect.
Interesting. I did have another question related to kind of the forbidden fruit effect. So you're kind of going back and forth between, not completely, shunning a food or saying, you can't have this versus giving into that craving more often. So when we're trying to find a balance between that, like what have you found most useful? For example, having a scoop of ice cream on a Friday night, and that being, that's your craving that you're giving into, but it's only once a week. So it's not like forbidden. So you get to have it and there's some balance there. Like, what have you found to be most useful and practical with your clients and yourself?
So theoretically speaking, what you should do, like rationally speaking, is basically think for every food that you could consume, whether it's worth it. And then ice cream it's like objectively, it's either worth it or not, because it has certain properties and it has certain nutrients, certain calories, etc. So it has pros and cons. And well, those may change based on the circumstances, but if we simplify things a little bit, we can say that certain foods are either worth it or they're not. And then rationally speaking, you should just consume the foods that you think are worth it, and you don't consume the foods that are not worth it. In practice, though, it doesn't quite happen like that for most people. They need some experience. So often what happens is with these things, the most important thing is that you have that ice cream on a certain day. And then what you can do is, I really liked what you said about being mindful and taking a step back. In particular, what I like is before you eat anything is just to make it go through your head what the energy density of the food is. So with ice cream, usually it's 200 to 400 calories per 100 grams. And that's just a number that has to go through your mind. Because if you're on a diet and you're constantly eating things with low energy densities, like 50 to 100, maybe 200 max, and then you get that figure like 200 to 400, that at least makes you realize like, okay, that's a lot of calories for how little food it is. And well, let's say you eat it and it's still not a problem. Then the important thing is to afterwards reflect on whether it was worth it. So especially when you tally up your calories for the day, it's like, I didn't quite manage to get an energy deficit today. Why is that? Well, it's the 400 calories of ice cream, very blatantly. So then you think, okay, was it worth it to negate my diet day for the ice cream? And then in the particular case of ice cream, what I would say in particular is you should look for alternatives, because there are loads of good high protein and low calorie ice creams available these days. In fact, I read about the technology from, I think, Nestle to make basically like not 0 calorie, but very, very low calorie ice cream with emulgators, I think it was, sweeteners plus emulgators. So you basically get sort of the fat-like texture and the texture of ice cream, and the sweetness from sugar. You make ice cream that doesn't have sugar and has very little fat. And that technology has existed for 15 years, I think, probably more. But it just didn't catch on because people don't want it. But you have these foods available. So especially in those cases, you should look at, could I eat something else that does the same job and is what economists would call a dominant option in some cases. Like a dominant option is a food that is just better or a dominant option is when you have two choices or more, and one is just better in every single aspect than the other. Now, it's almost never as black and white like that with food, because probably the high protein ice cream doesn't taste quite as well. Sometimes it does, but you're sacrificing a little bit of taste for better everything else. And then you probably you may need to make that mistake maybe a few times, and then over time as long as you keep reflecting like that, you mindfully eat it, you reflect on whether it was worth it, and over time you come to the conclusion that the food is probably not worth it. Or you come to the conclusion that, I just love this ice cream so much, I don't get much craving from it, and that's fine, I can fit this into my lifestyle, I have the calories, I wouldn't want to spend them on anything else more, so fine, every Friday night or whatever, I definitely wouldn't plan it. But when you sometimes feel like you really want that ice cream, you can fit it into your macros. One important tip then is to eat it after you're already full, because research finds that if you eat foods that you are prone to start craving when you're hungry, then you actually stimulate the craving a lot more. But if you eat it when you're full, then it doesn't have that effect anymore of, it's not restrictive anymore, because you just have it for the taste. You eat a certain fixed portion. You don't want like the whole bowl and just start eating and, I'll stop at some point, my body will tell me, it's like, probably not. Or maybe when you finish, when you're at the bottom. But if you eat it actually to eat it, like I'm hungry, I'm going to eat ice cream, then you're going to be restricted, because unless you literally eat yourself full of ice cream, you're going to at some point have to say, okay, that's enough, I need to quit. And then you essentially have the forbidden fruit effect, right? Because you have something that you want to eat, but you can't eat. So it's really important to have those more indulgent things after meals. One of the few traditions, basically dessert, like dessert after meals, that actually works well scientifically.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. And I feel like everything that you just said is like what some of the scenarios that I even still go through in my head. Like, for example, last Friday night, I was with a bunch of people who were got ice cream right after dinner. And I was like, is this worth it? Or can I go home and make my protein ice cream, which I know is like 10 times the volume that I get for half the calories of like one small scoop. And is that more worth it to me? Am I going to enjoy that better if I just kind of wait a little bit, like wait an hour until I get home and have, it's kind of that instant gratification versus the delayed gratification, which comes into play with everything related to dieting, right? But just that, in that one instance, it's like going through that in your head and saying, okay, if I can just hold off a little bit, I can kind of get, the best of both worlds. Obviously with the protein ice cream, maybe the taste is not exact to, full fat, homemade ice or home churned ice cream, whatever you want to call it. But if you learn how to make it and in a way that is, you still have that texture and the flavor and all that, it can actually be awesome. I mean, I've been playing around with protein ice cream for probably 10 years. And like, it took me a while to find a recipe that was like, okay, this is good. So it's just kind of, learn that. And like you said, that's it's very accessible these days, especially with the lower calorie ice creams out there. And I even think just making your own and learning how to make your own with protein powder is a really great thing to have on hand for sure.
The technique what you did there is what psychologists would call episodic future thinking. So that's a technique that goes hand in hand with mindfulness. When you're feeling hungry, you want to eat something, you should, and you already know generally that doesn't really fit my diet or what I plan to eat. Then what you should do is think of the alternative and actually vividly imagine it, like exactly what you did. I can go home and I can have the low calorie ice cream. Or sometimes if you're at work, for example, and they bring out the cake or whatever food they have, maybe nuts that you don't even like that much, but you're hungry and they're right in front of you, then think, okay, I can go home. I have a nice meal prepared. I have this pasta or whatever, or this nice keto dish with cauliflower rice and whatever. And I can eat that and stick to my diet. And I know I like that too. So am I really going to enjoy, this that much more than just waiting a little bit and eating what I plan to eat? That's episodic future thinking. And the key is to really make it vividly imagine yourself eating what you plan to eat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that actually brings me back. So I remember what I was going to say like 20 minutes ago. You talked about skill, dieting being a skill. And I think that's super important to realize too, because it is a skill that you have to build. You have to build those skills of, learning what works for you, learning what keeps you satisfied, learning how to make those, mindful decisions. But it's also going to allow you to like maintain your results, right? Because maintaining your results afterward is also a skill, and the skills that you build during the time that you are being mindful through a fat loss phase, those skills are going to carry over to you actually being able to maintain your results long-term, right? And so that's something that I preach to my clients a lot, is just talking about like, it takes time, right? And not going on. And that's why usually, quote unquote, crash diets don't work unless you're going on a very aggressive deficit, but you're very skilled in dieting already, right? So it's not that, like, for example, you can do a 4-week aggressive fat loss phase, like maybe a mini cut or something like that. But if you aren't skilled on the things that you need to do to be able to adhere during that time, then also be able to maintain the results afterwards, then you're going to have a really hard time. And most people who are new to dieting probably haven't built the skill to be able to go into a super, super aggressive deficit versus maybe taking, 12 weeks and making it a little bit longer, but then you're building up that skill and those habits that will allow you to maintain the results afterwards. Because what's the point of doing it if you can't, maintain it, right? So yeah, that's what I wanted to mention. And then exactly what you said about, this like psychological side of things, that's also a skill. Like the mindfulness side of things is a skill that you need to build, because the more you do it, the more you become mindful of doing the mindfulness, right? Or that mindfulness practice. So
yeah, definitely. The sustainable perspective is so important, because it's something that you always get with clients, or some clients, they say like, how much fat can I lose if I hire you for 2 months? And then I always say, it doesn't matter, because I can make you lose 20 pounds of fat in 2 months, and if you don't learn how to do it and how to keep it off, then you will have spent all your money for absolutely nothing and wasted both of our times. Yep. You know, that maybe you get that one holiday for your wedding or that holiday for the beach, but really in the long term, that it's just not worth it. Like the amount of effort it takes to just get that for one holiday or whatever, it's never worth it. Mm-hmm. Instead, if in 1 month of coaching, you lose absolutely no fat, but you learn the skills to, you know, by the end of the month, it clicks and you know how to do it. And then you can get into, say, a 500 calorie deficit with no more effort, then that will net you results for a very long time afterwards. And if you can sustainably decrease your daily energy intake, especially for a woman, by 500 calories, you're going to lose a lot of fat over the next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Okay. I want to kind of, because we're getting to almost an hour here, I want to end on a kind of not a completely different subject, but a subject that I wanted to kind of ask you about aside from your book. So I want to kind of hear your opinion and your experience with low carb versus low fat diets, and more particularly kind of talking to like ketogenic diets and low carb diets and kind of your experience with that, with maybe yourself and your clients as well, and kind of what you found maybe from a bird's eye view for just looking at, you know, different people and your perspective on that. Because like I said, a lot of the people listening to this podcast are coming from that lower carb keto space. Maybe they're there and it's working for them and they love it. Or maybe they've been, you know, they tried, you know, keto low carb, it worked initially and now they're like, it's not working anymore. This isn't sustainable for me. Where do I go from here? So kind of just, I know that's a very long-winded question, but what's your experience with low carb versus low fat?
I think low fat is something that generally doesn't work long-term. So especially when you get below 10% of energy intake, even below 20, I don't like going below 20. You get significantly adverse effects on hormonal health. And especially in women, like basically all sex hormones decrease significantly with magnitudes that can be physiologically relevant. Often also you see massive problems with appetite. I think that's a trap actually that many people, like I see it a lot in contest competitors and I had it myself as well. When you're dieting and you have these fats, you think, oh, that's a lot of calories, you know, 9 calories per gram. If you take out the fats, suddenly you can eat a whole lot of broccoli. So you do that and that's fine for a few weeks. You can just eat a lot more food, but at some point something changes and there's not much research on this other than that, for example, the Ornish diet has terrible long-term adherence. But you get an insane appetite that actually takes a long time to come back. And if you keep the fats up a little higher, even though it can be hard in the short term, because it feels like you're not eating that much food, but it really helps with appetite management. And I think if you go the complete other direction, you go full keto, then you get into the sort of hate it or love it realm, because ketogenic diets have certain profound advantages. And there's research showing that some people, some research even shows that on average, people have better cognition and people have higher well-being in a ketogenic diet. But it doesn't take a lot of experience as a coach to know that a lot of people also really don't like ketogenic diets. They are very restrictive. Some people say they feel terrible. Usually that's with problems with implementing it, nutrient deficiencies, the keto flu in the first weeks with electrolyte deficiencies. But even when properly implemented, some people just really don't thrive on ketogenic diets. And I think a ketogenic diet is actually good for almost everyone to try if you don't have, you know, medical conditions that make it prohibitive. But it really opens your mind to different food choices, a different way of dieting, and also to the fact that you probably really don't need as many carbs as you might think. And when you've done that, then you can decide whether ketogenic dieting is right for you. And maybe it is, maybe you feel great, you don't have hunger. Hunger management is probably a big plus for keto dieting. And then afterwards, you can experiment with going out of ketosis and the skills you learned with the ketogenic diet, even if it was only a month or maybe even 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I'd say, is the minimum. Then you can implement those skills with a generally maybe low carb or even just moderate type diet. And it will almost always benefit you enormously, I've seen. So I really like the idea of ketogenic diets and then moving towards more flexibility, especially when you've achieved your fat loss results. And, you know, especially when you're trying to build muscle mass, there's quite some research showing that ketogenic diets can be actually sort of too effective for appetite management. And they're just very restrictive, and it becomes hard to consume enough calories. So people have difficulty putting on muscle mass with ketogenic diets, some people at least, and purely because it makes it hard to consume enough energy. And at that point, you really have to ask yourself, do I still really need to be in ketosis, or can I have a carb intake of say 200 grams for paleo levels and still be completely fine? Usually, you will be completely fine. And I think a generally good rule of thumb is that when your fat intake starts exceeding your protein intake, you should strongly start considering a non-ketogenic diet. Because, what can you eat that doesn't have carbs? Because your carb intake is going to be filled very easily. It doesn't have carbs and it doesn't have protein, but it does have fat. And then you're really like, drinking olive oil or something.
Yeah.
Which at that point, I've done it. Also when bulking in college and when I was lazy, I was eating nuts and drinking olive oil. And one time I drank I had so many calories left for the day, and I was like, I need to hit my macros. I drank probably like this much olive oil, and gosh. I felt it in my stomach. I could literally feel like the oil just in my stomach. Ugh. When I turned, I would feel the oil moving, and I was like, oh God, that's when I realized what am I doing?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. That is definitely intense. But yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that's definitely an approach that I take with a lot of my clients and a lot of people that I work with and kind of who go through my programs, whether they've coming from a low carb approach or they're wanting to try a low carb approach or a keto approach, it's all about, testing and assessing and, going through a period of time and seeing, also what your specific goal is. Like you said, is it, in a fat loss phase or bulking or building phase, or is it for the mental benefits, right? And the cognition, all of that. So there's so many different kind of realms to go down in that regard. I did have a quick question. So in terms of fat intake, what would your general guideline be for the minimum amount of fat that you recommend for clients?
Generally, I'd say 20%. I'm really reluctant to go below 20%, especially in women. And when possible, I like to err more on the side of 30. And I think the benefits I know based on research, the health benefits for at least sexual hormonal health, like estradiol, testosterone, growth hormone, they go up to about 40%, which is still pretty reasonable. Like some people say 40, if you use to bodybuilding type levels, 40% seems crazy, but many official health organizations recommend 30 or 35% of calories from fat. So it's very balanced. At that point, probably if you go over that, then you don't get significant hormonal benefit. There was a study from Vidic et al. Last year, and it compared fully ketogenic to non-fully ketogenic. And they had a similar improvement. Both had about a 33% improvement in testosterone levels. This was in men, but research in women is generally even more convincing for the hormonal benefits. So as one figure, I'd say 20%, but for women in particular, I do like to err on the 30, maybe even 40% if you have the calories.
Mm-hmm. And if you're in, obviously the percentage is based off of your calorie intake. So if you're in a deficit, your calories will go down, percentage will go down. Yeah.
Yes, and that's in this case actually beneficial because I would like to set calories or set fat intake like protein intake based on body weight. Like just say this is the requirement that your body needs. It doesn't matter what your total energy intake is. But the problem with that is you may simply not have the calories. If you're a woman and you're dieting and you're 1,400, 1,300 calories, some women just have to get to that level. And then it's great if I tell you, look, you need 80 grams of fat, but you're just going to have a very hard time fitting that in. It's like, what do? You have to compromise on something. So, and at that point, that's also when you should start considering a ketogenic diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. All right, last question, and then I think we're basically out of time, but I just want to know, what's your current dietary protocol just for our listeners, where you're at right now in terms of your carb, fats, and protein intake?
I'm bulking currently. I'm actually pretty much at that 40% fat intake. Protein intake is about 1 gram per pound. I probably go over that. So I'm a good 93 kilos right now. So my protein intake probably most days 200 grams. Not because I need it, but I generally recommend 1.8 gram per kilogram per day. But I almost always go over that from the other food I eat. Fat's probably at 40% and the rest is carbs. And I have a pretty adaptive metabolism, so I can bulk on pretty high calories. Although it actually is quite high, even for 93 kilos. I'm I'm currently at 4,000 calories, just did a mini cut, and probably will soon be 4,200 or so. That's generally 4,200, 4,500. If I'm not too active, I can bulk on that energy intake as a lean bulk approach.
And do you structure your macros throughout the day based off of like your training sessions, like timing, things like that? Like, do you put a bulk? I mean, obviously you're in a bulky phase, but I guess maybe this question is for in a fat loss phase because you'll have less calories. But do you tend to structure your carbohydrates around your training and keep fats, on the bookends of the day with that, or?
Generally, fat intake's pretty evenly distributed. If anything, it can be slightly front loaded, but in practice, it comes pretty even. Fat intake's a bit more towards the later part of the day. I don't think it matters much, especially with my current calories, where I distribute the carbs. Other than that, there is some research, like the SOFR study from Israel, that finds potential benefits of carb backloading. It's more relevant probably for cutting because appetite management is a big plus, and that's not really needed when bulking, at least at my current energy intake. But when cutting, I find it does help to have your carbs a bit backloaded, so more later in the day. And if you're a ketogenic diet, you should do a targeted ketogenic diet. I think in almost all cases, where you have at least say 15 gram net carbs pre-workout and post-workout, because it will be preferentially used by your muscles and it won't even deter much from ketosis. And I find that if you do that, many people can, even women, can have a net carb intake of about 50 grams and still be in significant ketosis.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I think a targeted approach is, if you're going to do keto, a targeted approach, especially if you are training hard, is probably the best approach that I've seen work.
Yeah, I'd say that is actually a dominant option over the normal ketogenic diet. Yeah,
for sure. Awesome. Okay, so I feel like I could ask you questions for another hour, but I want to respect your time. Do you want to just tell our viewers or listeners, where they can find you on social media, your website, anything exciting that you have coming up? Tell us about your book again, and anything at all that you want to talk about.
Sure. You can find everything on mennohenselmans.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I share a lot of new study reviews there. So you can find all of that on my website and my social media. Probably the best thing to do if you've never heard of me and you're interested in learning more is to subscribe to my email course, because then you get a tour of my most popular articles and contents, things people like the most, and it's a lot of free content. Yeah, and in terms of new projects, I have some interesting for people on low carb intakes. The first systematic review of carbohydrate requirements for strength training that's currently submitted, so this should come out this year. I have a diet break study that's actually just been accepted, so that's coming out soon. And in terms of projects, I'm actually still thinking myself, like, what do I want to, other than my scientific projects, where do I want to go from here? Like, do I want to write another book? But currently, I have my English PT course going, I have a full client load, I'm working on scientific papers. There's slowly coming international speaking engagements again, so it might be a while before I even have the mental space to start a whole big new project.
Awesome. Lots going on. I might have to have you back on to talk about those two studies.
Sure.
Once they come out, or once you want to talk about. Yeah, that would be awesome. Great. All right. Well, I will make sure to link all of that in the show notes and link the other articles that we talked about earlier in the episode. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. This was awesome. And yeah.
My pleasure. It was great talking to you.
Hey, bye. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of MetFlex and Chill. I hope you enjoyed it. It would be awesome if you could give the show 5 stars and leave a review on iTunes. We're trying to get placed in the top 100 health podcasts, and the 5-star ratings and reviews are what can help make that happen. I'll add step-by-step directions for leaving a review in the show notes. I know it's a big ask, but it really helps. Thanks again. See you next time.